The woman let out a piercing, grating wail, her voice echoing through the night's deserted alleyways. Her wide, terror-stricken eyes and pale face, nearly drained of all color, betrayed the depth of her fear. Thick, unappealing cheeks quivered like gelatine with each strained sound she made. And then there was the smell of fear, that intoxicating, unmistakable scent that transformed this aging human female, turning her from mere two-legged refuse into an irresistible prize. The creature standing before her, barely visible in the surrounding darkness, moved closer with unhurried steps, its tongue flicking out in anticipation. It could end this quickly, lunging for her throat and finishing the hunt. But the predator reveled in this moment, savoring the terror saturating the air like a drug. It dulled his caution and heightened his hunger. The long, fur-covered fingers of his paws moved soundlessly a few steps closer. Yes, human female, you can still crawl. You're not even wounded yet. But your fear, your paralyzing fear, has pinned you to the asphalt, robbing you of the strength to stand or flee. Not that it matters. Running would be useless. Your steps are no match for the predator's single, lethal leap. The victim let out another indecipherable sound, somewhere between a sob and a moan, her tear-filled eyes catching faint glints of light. The predator bared its teeth and sprang forward, slamming its front paws into her chest, pinning her to the ground. A sickening crunch echoed from her ribcage, followed by a rasping gasp. The creature barely registered it, having already caught the scent of fresh blood. Overcome by its instincts, it abandoned all restraint. Its jaws sank into her neck just above the right collarbone, tearing a chunk of flesh free. Warm blood flowed freely as the woman's body twitched violently beneath the beast, her fingers scraping weakly against the pavement. The predator closed its eyes with satisfaction, lapping at the rich, warm liquid spilling onto the ground. For a brief moment, a faint noise disrupted the feast. The beast froze, ears twitching in alertness, its nose drawing in the air. Amid the thick, cloying scent of blood, another odor emerged, foreign and intrusive. A soft, almost imperceptible click sounded in the darkness, too faint for human ears, yet just distinct enough for the predator's heightened instincts. It crouched low, muscles coiled. A treacherous bullet whizzed out of the shadows, grazing the fur on its back before embedding itself in the wall behind it. Snarling in frustration, the predator sprang into the darkness. Like a shadow, it vanished, navigating fences and walls with an almost spider-like grace, slipping away unseen from the armed kin of its slain prey. The city was teeming with others, soft, defenseless, blissfully unaware of the glowing amber eyes watching them, of the steel claws itching to strike. On a nearby rooftop, a man swore under his breath. The damn thing had slipped away again. Victim after victim, it left behind a bloody trail of mangled bodies, vanishing into the night before its hunters could finish the job. It was no surprise. The teams hadn't been equipped with proper weapons, silent, precise tools suitable for urban settings. Instead, they'd been handed ordinary rounds and ordered to chase down a creature no one fully understood. The bureaucrats pushing papers in their offices had no clue how much effort it took to kill even a lowly vampire with the primitive rifles they issued. But this was something else. An animal in behavior, perhaps, but cunning. Far smarter and more cautious than the usual creatures they dealt with. The hunter spat, grinding the spit into the rooftop with his boot. From his jacket's inner pocket he pulled out a battered old phone and dialed a familiar number. The woman was beyond saving, of course, but leaving her body sprawled in a pool of blood in the middle of the city wasn't an option either. Next time, it could be your wife, Philip," hissed a sinister voice from the depths of his paranoia. The hunter's frown deepened as he slung his rifle into its case and headed toward the rooftop exit. The creature wouldn't strike again tonight. As always, it would retreat to the city's underbelly, to sewers and basements, lurking where only the most reckless hunters or outright fools would follow. And it would wait, biding its time before resurfacing for another kill. He'd have to remind Nancy again not to step outside if it got anywhere near dusk. It had been a quiet, warm summer evening over a year ago now. Yet the memory remained vivid, seared into his mind. His wife's voice, trembling and on the verge of hysterical sobs, and the flat, disjointed words of the policeman on the other end of the line. "Just a scrap. We're still searching. The chances are slim." Kitty, his little kitten, how had it happened? If the devil didn't exist, then his creations surely roamed the earth. They infested this damned city, crawling out of every crack and shadow, leaving claw marks on walls and bloodstains on the streets. He remembered everything. She was 5 years old, running toward him with a crown of dandelions clutched in her tiny hands, her little fingers struggling to hold the fragile stems together. "Daddy, put it on. You'll look like a king," she said, her gray eyes sparkling with pride. And so he sat there, a makeshift crown of yellow blooms resting on his cropped hair. Kitty giggled and called for her mother to grab the camera. Then the creatures came. At first there were only a few, small and insignificant, easily dispatched alongside stray dogs. But unlike the dogs, these things weren't content with scraps from garbage bins or the occasional handout from some kind-hearted human. They craved warm blood and tender flesh. Once they'd tasted it, nothing else would satisfy them. They attacked, they killed, and they grew stronger, thriving on their grotesque diet. When their numbers became a genuine threat, hunting squads were formed, armed with specialized ammunition that could corrode their unnatural bodies from the inside out. The ranks of hunters filled with former soldiers who couldn't adapt to civilian life, and desperate men with nothing left to lose. Casualties were high enough to make even the promise of a hefty paycheck less appealing than the prospect of staying alive. Greg, a regular police officer at the time, had cautiously declined the offer to join. His superiors hadn't pushed him. "You've got a kid," they said. "She needs you," and he'd agreed, smiling as he thought of Kitty, of the doll he'd promised to get her for Christmas, and of dandelions. But then came the newspaper headline. The dry, detached words describing a missing child, listing her features and the clothes she'd been wearing. Catherine Heskett, 10 years old. Last seen wearing a white dress with a small green pattern. A torn scrap of that very dress was discovered later. He had personally identified it, recognizing the small green flower, now heavily stained with blood. Her blood, as the forensic tests confirmed. "Greg, are you drinking before your shift again? Did someone revoke the rules just for you?" Jake's annoyed voice sounded from behind him. Jake himself wasn't shy about hitting the bottle, but his tendencies were uncontrollable, which made the leader keep an extra close eye on him. "Man, can you stop being such a pain to everyone else?" The leader, an older man with streaks of gray in his hair and deeply set dark eyes, gave Greg a weary nod, grabbed the half-empty bottle of lemonade from the table, and took a deep swig, draining half of it in one go. Jake slumped into the nearest chair, eyeing the dark liquid in Greg's glass with suspicion. Philip's group let the predator slip through, the leader said quietly, but his words were heard by all. "Which means they've either completely lost their edge, or this thing is nastier than anything we've ever dealt with before." Greg's hand tightened around his glass, his knuckles turning white. Under the circumstances, he was feeling the impact of this creature's rampage the most. It moved through the city like death's scythe, slaughtering residents with ruthless efficiency. Somehow it managed to obscure its tracks. Bloody prints would appear on walls, rooftops, and then vanish entirely, only to reappear several blocks away. It simply couldn't move like that, whatever the hell it was. "Are we heading out, guys?" Another recent addition to the group appeared in the doorway, carrying a box of issued ammunition. Nobody knew his real name. He was strangely secretive about it, so they just called him Red. The nickname's origins were unclear, as his hair was a perfectly ordinary ash-blonde crew cut. Greg drained the last sip of liquid from his glass and rose heavily to his feet. The shift was beginning. The predator raced through the city, skimming along walls, gripping onto ledges, its amber eyes narrowed to blend even further into the gray urban landscape. Through his night vision goggles, Greg could make out its faint silhouette darting with impossible speed, even for a vampire. The shadow slipped into some bushes, squeezing through half-bare, twisted branches, before vanishing into the gaping hole of a storm drain. Its rusted grate ripped away along with chunks of asphalt. "So this is where you hide, you bastard," Greg muttered, inhaling deeply before signaling to a teammate, probably Jake, to direct him toward the beast's lair. Minutes later, he saw the silhouette of the hunter descending through the hole. It was time for Greg to head in as well. If this hunt ended successfully, and they finally filled the creature with enough bullets, he'd have a reason to drink like he hadn't in years. He might even invite Jake along, though he didn't particularly enjoy his company. The radio crackled to life. Underground interference made the signal poor, but the words were still discernible through the static. "There's no one here?" Lost it. More words followed, muffled and unclear, but the meaning was evident. Greg clenched his fists so tightly they ached. If hatred alone could kill, they wouldn't be wasting so much time on this hunt. The group gathered tensely near the hole, their eyes fixed on the darkness below. Red fiddled with the radio, trying to stabilize the connection. Jake and the captain are down there. They're not responding. Fred, another recent addition to the team, spoke in a flat voice. A former police officer, Fred was idealistic to a fault, but unaccustomed to the brutal realities of being a hunter. Greg cursed under his breath and crouched near the hole. "Don't even think about it. We wounded it. Probably. It could get more aggressive because of that," Red muttered, pointing to the blood-stained edge of the opening. "Then we need to finish it," Greg said, shining his flashlight into the pit. Spotting the bottom, he easily dropped down. It wasn't too far. The familiar stench of the sewer hit him immediately. Among the usual foul odors, one stood out. Faint, but unmistakable. The scent of blood. His flashlight beam revealed a circular opening in the distance, where something indeterminate loomed in the shadows. As Greg moved closer, he made out a figure in a hunter's dark uniform. The person appeared to be crouching, frozen, as if watching something in the darkened tunnel ahead. Yet there was something unnervingly unnatural about the pose, too. Relaxed. As he drew nearer, the light illuminated a dark pool of blood spreading across the floor and dripping into a nearby stream of sewage. Greg's heart sank as the beam revealed the horrific scene. Jake's lower jaw and part of his neck had been torn away, as if ripped by a barbaric force wielding inhuman strength. Blood soaked his uniform jacket and the exposed collar of his light-colored shirt. His eyes, the whites stark against the gloom, stared helplessly toward the ceiling. The radio lay discarded nearby, intact but smeared with blood. A low hissing sound emerged from the shadows. 4 pairs of amber eyes locked onto Greg. Jake hadn't had the chance to warn them. The creatures didn't charge immediately, giving Greg just enough time to grab Jake's discarded shotgun and fire at the face of the nearest leaping beast. The predator screeched and recoiled, clawing at its wounded snout. The others hissed and growled, circling, probing for an opening while throwing him off balance. Greg backed into the passage and took cover behind a wall. The creatures growled in frustration and advanced cautiously. From above, gunfire erupted. The team had opened fire at the entrance. Fred, his eyes wide and wild, targeted the hissing gray demons, who retreated into the shadows. Red followed, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the furry mass shifting in the passage. There are 3 of them now. There were 4, I think. Greg's mind refused to process things with its usual clarity. Everything blurred into a series of fragmented images. Fred was reloading his shotgun while Red, his face frozen in a grim mask, examined the overturned, mutilated body of their fallen comrade. The growls of the creatures had faded into the depths of the corridors. Somewhere in the distance they were running. The flashlight beam jumped erratically across the walls. A child's scream. Greg felt as though a bucket of icy water had been dumped over him. He froze, his eyes darting wildly into the darkness, one hand gripping the uneven concrete wall for support. Fred, noticing his sudden stillness, stepped closer and touched his shoulder. "Hey man, what's wrong?" Someone screamed. "A child." Greg's voice faltered. The sound came again, and he jerked toward it. "Did you hear that?" Fred nodded and headed toward a barely visible dark opening that at first glance seemed like nothing more than a recess in the brickwork. But now it was clear that beyond the opening lay either a tunnel dug out by the creatures or some naturally formed cavern. Keeping their weapons at the ready, Greg followed Fred inside, sweeping his flashlight across every corner in search of the source of the faint echoing sound. The air was thick with a stench, reminiscent of homeless encampments but somehow worse, an odor that had no place here. "Take a look at this," Fred said, his flashlight illuminating something at the far end of the cave. A bundle of rags. It whimpered softly and tried to retreat further into the shadows, away from the light. Greg stepped closer, peering at the shape. His heart plummeted, as if it had fallen from a great height and shattered into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to scream, to punch the wall, to feel pain. Anything to convince himself this was real, and not some cruel nightmare. He would recognize those features anywhere, even under layers of grime and tangled, matted hair. Was that blood? Kitty? Greg's voice trembled, filled with disbelief, as though he was speaking in one of the strange, dreadful dreams that had haunted him since that night. The girl clutched the tattered fabric in her thin, bony fingers, whimpered, and tried to burrow deeper into the rags. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. In her large gray eyes, the most beautiful, familiar eyes in the world, was a raw, animalistic fear. "Kitty." Greg dropped to his knees beside her. A lump formed in his throat, and an overwhelming wave of heat surged through his chest. Gently he took her fragile hands in his, pressing his face against them, as though afraid they might dissolve into smoke, crumble into the ash of the past. "Greg." Fred's voice reached him through a muffled haze. "We need to get out of here." Greg lifted the nearly weightless child into his arms and carried her out carefully. Kitty whimpered like a kitten and weakly struggled against his grasp. At the entrance, Red stood alongside a few other group members who had come down to join them. At their feet lay the captain's body. His head clung to his shoulders by a mere strip of flesh. his neck a gaping, bloody hole exposing his shattered spine. "Captain," Red began. But his words faltered when he saw the girl in Greg's arms. His eyes widened in shock as he struggled to say something, his mouth opening and closing silently. "Move out!" Greg barked sharply. The headless group obeyed without question, abandoning the lair. Greg pressed forward quickly. The child needed to get to a hospital. She was clearly in dire need of medical attention. "It's okay," he reassured himself silently, for some reason unable to say it aloud. "Daddy's here." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of crimson, and the air was beginning to cool. Kitty sat on the porch, fussing with a massive pile of dandelions they had carefully gathered together in a nearby meadow. Greg, his face softened by a warm smile that rarely left him now whenever he looked at his daughter, crouched beside her. He picked the fluffiest dandelion from the pile, gently tucked it behind her ear, and stroked her soft, wavy hair. Kitty looked at him with her beautiful gray eyes, like two bottomless pools. Since they had found her in the sewers, she hadn't spoken a single word. She only made strange, animalistic sounds, like the mewling of a 2-month-old kitten. It worried Greg a little, but the sheer joy of having her back far outweighed any concerns about her behavior. Kitty parted her lips slightly, as though struggling to say something. Greg leaned closer, his heart pounding with anticipation, already imagining the miracle of hearing her clear, bright voice again. How desperately he wanted to hear it. Her eyes widened in surprise. From her half-open mouth, a thick, dark red liquid gushed forth, soaking her light dress and staining the brilliant yellow dandelions. Greg couldn't remember how he managed to dial 911 with his shaking hands. He didn't remember the paramedics loading her limp body onto the stretcher, nor his own frantic pacing around the ambulance like a wounded animal, howling and urging them to hurry. He couldn't recall waiting in the hospital for what felt like hours, until a somber doctor finally emerged and reluctantly told him, massive internal injuries, incompatible with life. In that moment, Greg's heart died completely. Glass after glass, the cheapest, most potent booze he could find. It was the only way to survive the night. He was in a fog, barely coherent, when his phone shrilled loudly. Kitty, missing? Her body. Greg could barely comprehend what was happening, what the trembling, frantic voice of the doctor had been trying to tell him for the past 10 minutes. The sheet had been torn, and on its once pristine whiteness were several bloodstains. That was all that remained of the girl with the bottomless gray eyes. Of the daughter he had only just found again. The police scoured the area, but their efforts yielded nothing. No one could understand why someone would steal the body of a little girl. "Greg, you need to get some sleep," his boss repeated for what felt like the 10th time as Greg hurriedly prepared, consumed by the mad idea of joining the search and doing something, anything, to quiet the storm inside him. Ignoring the advice, he was desperate to plunge into the darkness, to find something, to keep himself occupied. The police car greeted Greg with stifling heat and the acrid smell of cheap cigarettes. The faint beams of the headlights illuminated tangled bushes and trees, pale house walls, and the dark stretch of road ahead. Distant gunshots and shouts caused the driver to abruptly change course. "Looks like they ran into something. Damn creatures are everywhere," he muttered grimly. There was a paradoxical quality to his words, but no one in the car found it remotely amusing. Not a single face cracked even the faintest hint of a smile. The predator was in a frenzy, mauling the mutilated body of an officer it had dragged into a tree. Blood poured from the dangling entrails, dripping to the ground like a macabre, demonic waterfall. "Give me that!" Greg demanded. practically ripping a pistol from the hands of one of the stunned officers frozen in silent horror. The familiar weight in his hands was reassuring. A standard-issue firearm loaded with a few specialized rounds. These bullets were supposed to be effective against the creatures, though at this point, it was little more than a hope he desperately clung to. The beast in the tree lifted its head from the bloodied remains. Its amber eyes gleamed, catching the faint glow of flashlights. Its jaws parted, releasing a guttural growl that radiated menace. Up close, it looked even larger, even more terrifying. Every movement exuded not just power, but a haunting grace that underscored how deadly it truly was. Greg aimed the pistol directly at it, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could fire, the creature leaped, springing from the tree, with the fluidity of a predator accustomed to nocturnal hunts. Its claws scraped the ground, leaving deep gouges in the dirt. The sound of the gunshot shattered the night. The bullet missed, striking the trunk of a tree instead. Greg took off in pursuit. The creature was faster, but it left behind a bloody trail mixed with deep claw marks in the earth. His heart pounded so hard it felt as though it might burst from his chest. Every step sent pain shooting through his sides, but he refused to stop. The flashlight beam danced erratically over the bushes, branches whipping against his face. He could hear it ahead, its heavy, labored breathing. The beast veered to the right, vanishing behind a tall thicket. Greg pushed forward, only to skid to a halt as he reached the edge of a ravine. Below, a wide, dark opening loomed, a tunnel leading into the unknown. The creature's tracks disappeared at its edge. The smell was heavy and cloying, a blend of coppery blood and something putrid. Everything about the scene felt wrong. Greg switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the cave's entrance. Damp stone walls glistened faintly, reflecting the cold light. The air grew colder, each breath resonating in his chest. With his pistol raised, Greg carefully descended into the ravine, trying to move silently. Each step echoed in the oppressive stillness. The cave was wide but with a low ceiling, amplifying the sense of claustrophobia. Greg advanced cautiously, his focus locked on the darkness ahead. The flashlight illuminated murky puddles, claw marks etched into the stone, and fragments of bones scattered across the floor. A sound broke the silence. A mixture of a growl and a pained moan, muffled and strained. Greg froze, aiming his pistol toward the noise. The creature lay deeper within the cave. The flashlight beam caught its form, pulling it from the shadows. It was massive and strong, but now it looked weakened. Its chest rose and fell heavily, blood dripping steadily from a wound in its side. It lifted its head, meeting his gaze. Its amber eyes still burned brightly, but there was no rage in them now, only exhaustion. Greg took a cautious step forward, his fingers tightening around the gun. The creature pressed itself against the wall, its claws scraping the stone, leaving long, jagged grooves. The smell of blood grew stronger, mingling with the damp air of the cave. Greg watched as fresh blood seeped from the beast's wound, darkening the fur on its side. It tried to rise, but its limbs buckled, and it collapsed back onto the ground. Its breathing grew louder, more ragged. Greg stepped closer, his flashlight fully illuminating the creature now. Its fur was matted with blood, its muzzle scratched and battered. It was the same predator, but the overwhelming menace it once exuded was now absent. He aimed the pistol squarely at its head. It blinked, but made no move to attack. Greg couldn't explain what stopped him. Something in its eyes, in its movements, struck him as almost human. The silence of the cave was broken by a faint sound. Footsteps. Greg spun, aiming his flashlight toward the noise. Another figure emerged from the darkness. This one was massive. It moved slowly but with deliberate confidence. The flashlight's beam revealed its immense frame, covered in dense, dark fur. Its eyes burned like fire, and every step sent vibrations through the ground. The wounded creature on the floor growled, struggling to rise. Its breathing turned to desperate gasps as it pressed its back against the wall, as though preparing for one final, desperate attack. Greg stepped back, trying to keep both creatures within his field of vision. The dark figure stopped, turning its head toward Greg. Its growl was deep and resonant, filling the cave like a thunderous roar. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. The creature on the ground moved first. Despite its injuries, it lunged with startling speed, aiming its claws at the new enemy's throat. The black predator roared, swiping its attacker aside with brutal force. The wounded beast slammed against the wall but rose again, attacking once more. Greg stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He could shoot, but he didn't know at whom. The flashlight's beam bounced erratically around the cave, catching glimpses of the ferocious struggle. Every slash of claws, every movement was charged with lethal intent. The black beast clearly had the upper hand. Its strikes were precise and powerful, each one inflicting more pain on the wounded creature. Greg's heartbeat raced faster and faster. He raised his pistol, aiming it at the black predator. In the dim light of the cave, the two creatures appeared as shadows ripped from a nightmare. Each strike was deliberate, every movement a deadly dance. The black creature was larger, stronger, and faster. It dominated the fight, forcing the smaller predator to retreat again and again, though it refused to give up. The wounded beast moved with a desperation Greg couldn't understand. Its strikes were weakening, its leaps less confident, but it continued its assault, ignoring its pain. The black predator let out a thunderous roar, the sound reverberating through the cave and shaking the walls. It swiped with its claws, sending the smaller creature crashing against the wall again with a heavy thud. Greg raised his pistol, taking aim at the black beast. His finger hovered on the trigger. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to fire, to take the shot. But something held him back. The wounded creature rose again, its legs trembling. It took another step forward, its claws scraping against the stone floor. The black beast growled, advancing slowly toward it. Greg could see that this wasn't just a fight. There was something more, something he couldn't understand but could feel. The wounded beast seemed to be losing. Its body shook from exhaustion, its wounds were deep, and blood streamed down its sides. Yet in its amber eyes, fury still burned brightly. It made one final lunge, aiming for the black predator's throat. Its claws sank into the beast's flesh, and the black creature roared in pain. But its retaliation was even more devastating. With a single powerful strike, it flung the smaller beast against the wall and lunged, pinning it against the stones. Greg saw the massive claws tear into the creature's side. Blood sprayed onto the walls. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He couldn't stand and watch any longer. The pistol fired. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet struck the black beast in the side. It roared, spinning to face him. Greg fired again, aiming for its head. This time, the bullet grazed its shoulder, forcing the beast to retreat a few steps. The wounded predator seized the opportunity. It leapt forward, its claws sinking into its opponent's throat. The wet, crunching sound was unmistakable. The black creature howled, its body convulsing before collapsing to the ground, letting out one final growl. Silence returned to the cave. The wounded beast stood over its fallen enemy, its breathing heavy and labored. It swayed, then slowly sank to its knees, Greg approached cautiously, his pistol still trained on it. The flashlight illuminated its form. Its body was covered in blood, its fur disheveled. Its amber eyes met his. It didn't move, only stared at him. There was something strange in its gaze, something almost human. Greg lowered his weapon, his insides churning. He took another step closer, then froze as a sound came from deeper within the cave. A low, ragged noise like labored breathing. He swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound. Something was moving in the darkness. Another creature. Greg raised his pistol again, gripping it tightly. The wounded beast lifted its head, its gaze fixed on the shadows. It growled weakly, the sound faint but defiant. From the darkness a figure emerged. It was smaller than the black beast, but still imposing. Its amber eyes burned with the same unsettling light. The new creature stopped, staring at the fallen body of its kind. Then its gaze shifted to the wounded predator. A chill ran down Greg's spine. The new beast didn't move. It simply stood there watching them. The wounded predator rose shakily to its feet, its breathing growing louder. It took a step forward, its claws digging into the floor again. Greg slowly backed away, trying to keep both creatures in sight. He didn't know what to do. The situation was becoming increasingly bizarre. The new creature growled, its voice low and rasping. It stepped forward, but the wounded predator blocked its path. They froze, staring at each other. Greg stood off to the side, watching. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the weight of something significant unfolding before him. The wounded beast, despite its weakened state, stood firm between Greg and the new threat. Its bloodied fur and labored breathing spoke of its injuries, but its stance radiated determination. The new creature, freshly emerged from the depths of the cave, remained still. Its amber eyes were locked on the injured predator. Something unspoken passed between them, something Greg couldn't quite grasp. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the two were communicating in a way beyond human comprehension. Greg stepped back, gripping his pistol tightly. The flashlight shook slightly in his hand, illuminating first one figure, then the other. The wounded predator growled again, a warning. Its voice was hoarse and broken, but there was still a note of threat in it. The new creature responded with a roar. The sound was louder and deeper than any Greg had heard before. It wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. Greg squinted, trying to focus. He didn't know what to do. The scene before him defied explanation. The new creature took another step forward. Its claws scraped against the stone floor, creating a harsh sound. It was smaller than the black predator, but its movements were no less intimidating. The wounded beast growled again, stepping forward to meet it. Its legs trembled, but it held its ground. Greg raised his pistol, taking aim. He couldn't let the new creature attack. But before he could fire, the wounded predator lunged. Its leap was unexpected, even in its condition. It collided with the new creature, its claws tearing into its shoulder. The new beast howled, its body jerking back, but it didn't fall. It swiped with its claws, sending the wounded predator crashing into the wall. Greg fired. The bullet struck the side of the new creature, causing it to howl in pain. It turned toward him, its eyes blazing with fury. He fired again. This time, the bullet hit its chest, forcing it to stagger. The wounded beast rose once more. Its breathing was even more ragged, but it seized the moment, lunging forward. Its claws sank into its opponent's throat, pinning it to the ground. The crunch of bone echoed through the cave. Greg watched as blood poured across the stone floor. The new creature no longer moved. The injured beast stood over its fallen foe, its chest heaving with effort. Slowly, it turned its head toward Greg. Its amber eyes, which had recently burned with fury, now held a different expression. The threat was gone. Greg lowered his pistol, unsure of what to say or do. The creature swayed, then sank to the ground. Its body trembled with exhaustion as its labored breathing filled the silence. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on it. His gaze traveled over its wounds. They were deep, and blood continued to flow. But something strange caught his attention. It seemed as though the creature's body was trying to heal itself. The flashlight illuminated its face. Now that the fight was over, it appeared less terrifying. There was something peculiar, almost elusive in its appearance. Greg crouched, keeping his weapon ready. Its eyes met his. This time, there was something in them he couldn't explain. The creature slowly closed its eyes, its breathing growing fainter. Greg looked around. The cave had returned to silence, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He pulled out his radio. "This is Greg. I'm in the cave, 2 neutralized. Repeat, 2. I need backup." There was no response. He cursed, tucking the radio back into his pocket. The injured beast stirred. Its limbs trembled, but it managed to rise again. It glanced at him, then toward the cave entrance. Greg stood slowly, watching its every move. It took a step, then another, heading toward the exit. Its gait was unsteady, but it kept moving. Greg didn't know what to do. He should stop it, but instead, he followed, keeping his pistol trained on it. They exited the cave. The moonlight illuminated the creature's figure, highlighting its injuries. It paused for a moment, lifting its head to the sky. Greg stood a few steps behind, never taking his eyes off it. It turned to look at him, and there was something in its gaze he couldn't understand. Then it slowly turned away and disappeared into the forest. Greg remained where he was, a strange feeling rising within him. He pulled out his phone and took several pictures of the cave entrance before leaving it behind. Standing at the edge of the forest, Greg stared into the darkness where the creature had vanished. Its departure left him with an odd sensation. This wasn't simply victory or defeat. It was something else, something he couldn't explain. He tightened his grip on the pistol, feeling his fingers tremble. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind was restless. He needed to make sense of what had happened. The cave behind him felt lifeless. The bodies of the creatures remained inside, but Greg wasn't ready to go back just yet. The forest around him was silent, unnaturally so. Slowly, he made his way back to the cave, deciding to inspect it once more. Every step sent jolts of pain through his legs, but he forced himself to move forward. Entering the cave again, the air felt heavier. The faint light of his flashlight revealed blood-stained stone walls and grime-covered floors. Greg approached the body of the black predator. It lay motionless on the ground, its massive form still intimidating even in death. He examined it closely. Its claws were enormous, its teeth sharp as blades. Its fur was dark, almost coal-black, with rare streaks of silver. But Greg noticed something else. Around the creature's neck, beneath its thick fur, were strange marks. They resembled scars, long and deep, but their shape was too deliberate to be random wounds. He moved the flashlight along its body. Similar marks were etched into its side, as if they had been carved intentionally. Greg frowned, pulling out his phone to take several pictures. His attention shifted to the other beast, the one that had died in the fight. This creature was smaller, its body less menacing, yet its paws bore the same markings. What does this mean? Greg thought, feeling a growing unease. He stood and walked toward the center of the cave. Among the scattered bones and pools of blood, he noticed something strange. A stone pedestal, partially obscured during the earlier chaos, now stood out. The pedestal was etched with symbols, ancient and weathered but still discernible. Some resembled circles, while others were intersecting lines forming intricate patterns. Greg shone his flashlight over it, trying to memorize every detail. He didn't know what the symbols meant, but something told him this place was significant. At the center of the pedestal lay a shard of material. At first glance, it looked like bone, but upon closer inspection, Greg realized it was metal. He picked it up, the cold surface biting into his palm. The shard was covered in the same symbols as the pedestal. Greg slipped it into his pocket and continued surveying the cave. He needed to gather as much evidence as possible before leaving. When he finally exited the cave, the moonlight bathed the forest. The cool air brought a fleeting sense of relief. But exhaustion weighed heavily on him. Still, he couldn't allow himself to stop. He headed back to the car, parked at the forest edge. His steps were heavy, but his mind remained sharp. Reaching the vehicle, Greg heard the forest stir to life. The sounds of nocturnal birds and rustling leaves filled the air once more, replacing the oppressive silence of the cave. Sliding into the driver's seat, he tossed the flashlight onto the passenger side. The tension in his body began to ebb, but chaos still churned within him. He pulled out the shard he had found and examined it closely. The symbols were intricate, and something about them felt familiar. Greg snapped a few photos and sent them to Red, hoping his teammate might uncover something. The shard was surprisingly heavy for its size. Scratches on its surface suggested someone had tried to damage it. He tucked it back into his pocket and started the car. The drive back to the city was quiet. Greg focused on the road, trying not to think about everything he had just experienced. When he reached the garage, Red was already there. He sat at a table, sorting through ammunition, but looked up as Greg walked in. "You look like crap," Red said, pushing the box aside. Greg didn't reply. He tossed the metal plate onto the table and crossed his arms over his chest. "What's this?" Red asked, frowning. "It was in the cave," Greg replied curtly. "Can you figure out anything about it?" Red picked up the plate, running his fingers over the engraved symbols. "This is weird," he said, examining it closely. "Looks old. Could be cult-related." "Cult?" Greg echoed, narrowing his eyes. Red shrugged. "Stuff like this usually comes from people obsessed with the supernatural. It could be connected to the creatures, but I'm not sure yet." Greg's thoughts drifted back to the cave, the creatures, and the markings on their bodies. "See what you can find out," he said, heading for the door. Red nodded, placing the plate into a drawer. Greg stepped outside, his unease growing by the minute. Morning didn't bring sunlight to Greg. It brought a heavy emptiness. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this drained. Lying on an old couch in the corner of the garage, he stared at the peeling ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened the previous night. In the adjacent room, Red was busy with the plate, muttering to himself as he furiously typed on a keyboard. Greg got up, his muscles aching with every movement. His body protested, but his mind was fixed on one thought: finding answers. He walked into the room where Red sat hunched over a computer screen. An outdated database filled with articles and images, many of them seemingly pulled from books on myths and legends, was open. "Find anything?" Greg asked, sitting across from him. Red nodded, though his expression was serious. "This isn't just some random plate," Red began. "The symbols on it are connected to something mentioned in old documents. I found references to a group that existed sometime in the mid-20th century. They called themselves the Keepers of the Lunar Circle." "The Keepers of what?" Greg frowned. "A cult," Red explained. "They believed the moon was the source of an ancient power capable of altering not just nature but human essence itself." Greg leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "And how does that tie into these creatures?" Red clicked his mouse, pulling up a new image. The screen displayed a drawing of a man surrounded by half-human, half-beast figures. The same markings that Greg had seen on the creatures' bodies were etched into their skin. Apparently they believed they could control these creatures using specific rituals, Red said. "These scars, they're not just injuries, they're symbols of dominance." A chill ran through Greg. They tried to tame them? Red shrugged. "Maybe. But judging by what we saw, they clearly lost control." Silence filled the room. Greg's mind returned to the beast in the cave, its gaze heavy with exhaustion and something else he couldn't define. "So they're tied to that cave," Greg muttered, more to himself. "Not just that cave," Red said, clicking again. A map appeared on the screen. The plate has coordinates etched on it. I cross-referenced them with our database. They point to another location, just across the state border. Greg straightened, his interest piqued. "What's there?" Red shrugged. "No one knows. The place has been marked as abandoned for decades. Might be another den." Greg stood, a renewed energy surging through him. "We need to check it out." Red looked up, his face grim. "You sure? After what happened?" "I don't have a choice," Greg replied. His thoughts drifted back to his daughter, her frail body lying in that hospital bed. That memory was his only motivation now. The drive to the coordinates took several hours. The road led them through desolate stretches of land where there were no houses, no people. Only dried-out trees, a low-hanging sky, and a road stretching endlessly into the horizon. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting. Before them stood the ruins of an old building, which appeared to have once been a warehouse or factory. Moss clung to its walls, the windows were shattered, and parts of the roof had caved in. Red cut the engine, and they stepped out of the car. The air was cold and damp, with a metallic tang that reminded Greg of rust. Greg moved closer, his pistol at the ready. His eyes scanned the area. It was quiet, but the silence felt unnatural. "Don't you think this is too easy?" Red asked, studying the building. "Maybe," Greg replied, his gaze fixed on the entrance. They stepped inside. It was darker inside than out. Their flashlights illuminated old boxes, collapsed beams, and the rusted remnants of machinery long past its usefulness. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Every step echoed, the sound seeming too loud. Greg stopped, straining to listen. Ahead, a noise broke the silence. A faint scraping sound, muted but distinct. He raised his pistol, moving cautiously toward the source of the sound. Red followed, doing his best to remain quiet. As they reached the center of the building, their flashlights revealed something unusual. On the floor was a circle made of metal plates, covered in the same symbols as the one Greg had found. "What is this?" Red whispered, examining the circle. Greg stepped closer, studying the structure. It looked ancient, but surprisingly intact. In the center of the circle lay an object draped in cloth. He reached out and slowly pulled the fabric away. Underneath was a small metallic vessel resembling an urn. "This looks like—" Red began, but his words were cut off by a sound from deeper within the building. It was a roar, loud, furious, and piercing. Greg jumped to his feet, raising his pistol. "We're not alone," he said, pointing his flashlight toward the sound. Red pulled out his weapon, his hands visibly trembling. The roar echoed again, closer this time, reverberating off the walls and filling the space around them. "Greg, maybe we should just leave," Red suggested, his voice weak. "No," Greg replied firmly, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. They were in for a fight, and Greg was ready. The roar rolled through the building, forcing both men to freeze in place. It was deep and furious, like a warning from the depths of the darkness itself. Greg aimed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing. Only an oppressive blackness that seemed almost tangible. "That's something big," Red whispered, tightening his grip on his weapon. Greg took a cautious step forward, careful to make as little noise as possible. His pistol was raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. They moved toward the source of the sound, staying close to the walls. Each step echoed faintly, heightening the sense of danger. The sound came again, this time closer. A growl, full of menace. Greg stopped, scanning the area. His flashlight illuminated a long corridor leading deeper into the building. On the floor were deep scratches, claw marks that trailed off into the shadows. "It's down there," he said, nodding toward the corridor. Red nodded back, his face tense. They continued forward, following the trail. The stench of decay grew stronger, the air heavier with every step. Greg halted when his flashlight caught something on the ground. A bone, stripped clean and coated with dried blood. "This isn't an animal," he murmured, studying the find. The bone was too large, too precise in shape to belong to an animal. It was a human femur. Red swallowed hard, glancing nervously around. "Are you sure we should even be here?" Greg didn't answer. He raised his pistol and pressed onward. The corridor opened into a large, nearly empty room. Scattered across the floor were remnants of old equipment, boxes, and debris. But it wasn't the clutter that drew their attention. In the center of the room, amidst the wreckage, stood another pedestal, similar to the one Greg had seen in the cave. Its surface was engraved with symbols that seemed to faintly glow under the flashlight's beam. On top of the pedestal rested an object resembling the urn they had found earlier. But this one was larger, its surface adorned with intricate reliefs. Greg approached cautiously, examining the pedestal. "This looks like some kind of ritual site," he said, running his fingers over the symbols. Red hung back, his eyes darting around the room. "If it's a ritual, what was it for?" Before Greg could answer, a sound broke the silence. A low, grinding noise, heavy and ominous. He spun around, pointing his pistol toward the source. From the darkness, a figure emerged. At first it was just a silhouette, barely discernible in the dim light. But as it moved closer, Greg saw it for what it was, a creature. Its body was covered in thick fur, its eyes glowing with a piercing amber light. It was another predator, but not like the ones they had encountered before. This one was larger, stronger. Its movements were fluid, yet menacing. Greg raised his pistol, aiming directly at it. "Back off," he shouted, but the creature didn't stop. It growled, baring its teeth. Its claws scraped against the floor, creating an ear-splitting sound. Greg fired. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, making it stagger. But it didn't fall. Red fired a second shot, the bullet piercing the creature's side and drawing a furious roar. Instead of retreating, the beast charged. Greg barely managed to dive out of the way as its claws slammed into the floor. He fired again, aiming for its head, but the creature was too fast. Red screamed as the beast struck him with a powerful swipe, sending him crashing into the wall. Greg fired another shot, this time hitting its chest. The creature roared, its body convulsing, but it still stood. Greg stepped back, quickly reloading his weapon. The beast turned its blazing eyes on him, growling as it prepared to leap again. But before it could attack, another sound echoed through the building. It was a roar, but not one of an animal. It sounded as though the building itself had come alive and was screaming. The beast froze, its gaze shifting toward the source of the noise. Greg seized the moment, firing once more. The bullet struck its head, and the creature collapsed to the floor. Silence fell over the room once again. Greg hurried to Red, who was slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. "You okay?" Greg asked, extending a hand. Red nodded, pulling himself up with a grimace. "That was too close," he said, wincing in pain. Greg turned to the creature's body. Its eyes no longer glowed, and its form began to dissolve, disintegrating into black ash. He shifted his attention back to the pedestal. "There's more to this place," he said, moving toward the center of the room. Greg stood over the crumbling remains of the beast. The black ash scattered slowly across the floor, as if drawn by an unseen force. Red remained against the wall, his breathing ragged and uneven. "This place? It's not just abandoned," Greg said, shining his flashlight on the pedestal. "Something happened here, and it's not over." Red glanced up, a faint smirk on his face. "You think that thing is going to explain everything?" he asked, gesturing toward the pedestal. "Stuff like this. I've seen it before. It never leads to anything good." Greg ignored the remark. The pedestal seemed to pull his gaze, demanding that its secrets be unraveled. Its surface shimmered faintly, the strange symbols coated with a light dusting of age and neglect. At the center of the pedestal lay an urn, identical to the one they had found earlier, but larger. Its surface was covered in intricate raised carvings that looked far older. Greg reached out and carefully picked it up. It was heavier than it appeared. The metal it was made of felt both solid and oddly warm to the touch. He examined it closely, looking for any clues. His attention was drawn to the inscriptions at its base. "Is this instructions?" he muttered, tracing the symbols with his finger. Red, who had pushed himself up from the wall, approached cautiously. His eyes were fixed on the urn. "I'm not sure, but it looks like an activator. Something like a key." "A key to what?" Greg asked, frowning. Red shrugged. "I don't know. But something tells me if you use it, the consequences won't be good." Greg narrowed his eyes, scanning the room around them. "We're already too far in to just walk away." Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the roar they'd heard earlier. This time it was louder, closer. It came from somewhere deep within the building. Greg raised his pistol, his ears straining to catch any movement. Red tensed up again, gripping his weapon tightly. "Whatever it is, it's not staying hidden anymore," Red said, nodding toward the hallway. Greg glanced at the urn, then at the pedestal. His gut screamed at him to leave, but he knew that wasn't an option. "We have to deal with this," he said, heading for the exit of the room. Red sighed but followed behind him. The corridor they entered was long and narrow. The walls felt uncomfortably close, and the air grew heavier with each step. Greg led the way, his pistol ready. His flashlight flickered over strange marks. Deep scratches on the walls and dried bloodstains on the floor. Every step echoed, the sound unnervingly loud in the confined space. They reached a fork in the corridor. It split into two directions. "Which way?" Red asked, glancing nervously down each path. Greg listened closely. From one of the passages came a faint sound, like claws scraping against stone. "That way," he said, gesturing with his pistol. They moved cautiously toward the noise, trying to keep their steps as quiet as possible. The sound grew louder. It wasn't just scraping now. It was accompanied by a low, heavy breathing. Greg stopped as they reached a large archway. Beyond it lay another room shrouded in darkness. He aimed his flashlight inside, and its beam illuminated a massive figure standing in the center. The creature was larger than any they had encountered before. Its body was covered in thick black fur, and its eyes burned with an intense amber glow. It stood motionless, as if waiting for them. Greg felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't just another beast. This was something older, something far more dangerous. "Holy shit," Red whispered, raising his weapon shakily. "What the hell is that?" Greg stepped forward silently, his pistol aimed at the creature. The beast turned its head, its glowing eyes locking onto Greg. The silence was deafening. Then it moved. The creature advanced with a fluidity that was unsettling for something its size. Its paws made almost no sound against the stone floor, though its claws occasionally scraped deep gouges into the surface. Its glowing eyes were so bright that Greg felt as though his flashlight was no longer necessary. Greg held his ground, his pistol raised and his finger on the trigger. Behind him, Red's breathing grew rapid and uneven. "It knows we're here," Red whispered, but Greg didn't respond. The beast stopped just a few yards away. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying them. There was no rage in its movements, none of the wild aggression the other predators had displayed. This creature seemed calculating. Greg took a step forward, his weapon still trained on it. The beast didn't react. It remained still, its glowing eyes tracking his every movement. "Something's not right," Red murmured, trying to keep his voice low. The silence was broken by a sound. It was a roar, but unlike the ones they'd heard before. This one was quieter, deeper, and carried a power that made the air in the room vibrate. The creature lifted its head, its jaws parting to reveal sharp, blade-like teeth. And then it lunged. Greg fired. The bullet struck the beast's chest, but it didn't stop. Its claws slammed into the ground, shattering stone as it landed just a few yards away. He fired again, aiming for its head, but the creature was too fast. It dodged to the side and pounced on Red. Red screamed, firing wildly, but the beast knocked him to the ground. Its claws dug into his shoulder, pinning him down. Greg rushed toward them, firing another shot. The bullet hit the creature's side, making it yelp and retreat momentarily. Red rolled away, clutching his injured shoulder. His face was twisted in pain, but he was still alive. "Bastard. Almost got me," he gasped, struggling to his feet. The creature growled again, but this time it was quieter. It began circling them, its movements quick and precise. Greg tracked it carefully, his pistol following its every step. "This is more than just a beast," he said, not taking his eyes off it. The creature stopped, its gaze meeting his. In that moment, Greg felt a chill run down his spine. Those eyes were too aware, too intelligent. The beast took a step back, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Greg lowered his weapon, his breathing heavy, and labored. "Did it leave?" Red asked, clutching his wounded shoulder. "For now," Greg replied, still staring into the darkness. But Greg knew this wasn't a victory. That creature was unlike anything he'd faced before. It was stronger, smarter, and perhaps even more dangerous. Greg approached the pedestal in the center of the room. The urn was still in place, but it now seemed less significant. His thoughts were consumed by the creature they had just encountered. Red walked over, his steps slow and unsteady. "We can't stay here," he said. This place isn't meant for us." Greg nodded but didn't move. "That thing will come back," Red added, glancing at the urn. "And I'm not sure we'll survive next time." Greg picked up the urn, feeling its weight in his hands. "This could be the key to everything," he said quietly. Red scoffed. "Or to our death." They left the building, moving cautiously through the corridors. The silence had returned, but it no longer felt calm. It was the kind of silence that anticipated something. When they stepped outside, the night was nearly over. The first rays of dawn began breaking through the trees, painting the sky in pale pink hues. Greg turned to look back at the building. It stood there like a mute witness to the events they still didn't understand. "What now?" Red asked, settling into the car. Greg glanced at the urn resting in his hands. "Now we find answers," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. With that, they drove away, leaving the ruins and their unanswered questions behind. The car rumbled along the battered road at a steady pace. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, the engine's low hum the only sound breaking the silence. Greg focused on the road ahead, though his thoughts were far away. The urn lay wrapped securely in thick cloth on the back seat, yet its presence felt almost palpable. Red sat beside him, leaning against the door. His arm, hastily bandaged, was a stark reminder of their recent encounter. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting around as if trying to make sense of what they'd seen. "Do you even understand what we've gotten ourselves into?" Red finally said, breaking the silence. Greg gave a brief nod, his eyes never leaving the road. "No," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I'm stopping. You're stubborn. I'll give you that." Red said with a humorless chuckle. "That thing, that urn, or whatever you want to call it, it's connected to those creatures somehow. Are you sure we should even keep it?" Greg didn't answer immediately. His mind replayed the pedestals, the symbols, and how every detail seemed to be part of some larger puzzle. "I don't know what it does," he said finally, "but it might be the key to understanding all of this. A key that could open a door you might not want to see behind," Red muttered, looking away. A couple of hours later, they arrived at the garage. Red climbed out of the car with difficulty, staggering slightly as he made his way to the door. Greg grabbed the urn, feeling its weight as he carried it inside. The stale air of the garage greeted them, thicker and more oppressive than the night before. Greg placed the urn on the table and carefully unwrapped it from the cloth. "All right," Red said, dropping into a chair. "Now what?" Greg examined the urn once more. Its surface was ancient, yet the metallic sheen retained a strange brightness. The symbols etched into it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "We need to figure out what these symbols mean," Greg said. Red snorted. "Good luck with that. The only person who might know anything about this is that professor over at the university. But he hasn't been answering calls for weeks." Greg looked up. "Then we go to him." Red shook his head. "You're joking, right? After all this, you want to go somewhere that could get us both killed?" "If you're scared, stay here," Greg said, checking his pistol. Red didn't reply immediately, his face grim. Then he stood, grabbed his jacket, and muttered, "Fine, but you owe me for this." The university was in the next town over, and the drive took several hours. The whole time, Greg tried to focus on what questions to ask, but his thoughts kept drifting to Kitty. He saw her face, her eyes, no longer full of life. Red, in an attempt to distract himself, played music. But even that didn't help. Each minute felt longer than the last. By the time they reached the campus, the sun was setting, bathing the sky in blood-red hues. "He works in the archaeology department," Red said. pointing to an old brick building. They entered, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. "I thought there'd be more students here," Greg said, glancing around. "It's late. Everyone's gone home. If the professor's still here, we're lucky," Red replied. They reached the office door, but it was locked. A nameplate read, "Professor James Carter." Greg knocked, but there was no answer. "Damn," Red muttered, stepping back. Greg tried the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. "Let's check around back," he suggested. Circling the building, they spotted a light in one of the windows. Greg climbed the fire escape and peered inside. An older man with disheveled gray hair sat at a cluttered desk, scribbling notes. He seemed so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice them. "Professor Carter?" Greg called, tapping on the glass. The man flinched, turning sharply toward them. His face was tense, but upon seeing them, he relaxed slightly. "Who are you?" he asked, opening the window. "We need to talk," Greg said, holding up the urn. The professor's eyes widened at the sight of it. "Where did you find this?" he asked, taking the urn into his hands. "It's a long story," Greg replied, "but we need to know what it means." The professor carefully examined the urn, his fingers tracing the intricate symbols. "This is part of a ritual," he said, more to himself than to them. "What kind of ritual?" Greg asked. Carter lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with unease. "It's tied to an ancient cult that tried to—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Alter the essence of humanity." Red snorted. "Sounds like nonsense." "Perhaps," Carter replied. "But if this urn is still active, nonsense could become reality." Greg tensed. "What does it do?" The professor looked at the urn again. "It could be the key to lifting—" "A curse," he said softly. Carter set the urn on the table, running his fingers over its surface as if trying to sense the power hidden within. His expression was serious, the lines on his forehead deepening with each movement. "You realize this isn't just an ancient artifact?" he said finally, still focused on the symbols. "We figured that much out," Greg replied, crossing his arms. "What matters is, what do we do with it?" Carter raised his head, his expression grim. "These symbols, they describe a ritual that binds the living and the dead," he began. "This urn was created to contain something that was never meant to exist." "What does that mean?" Red interrupted, clearly losing patience. The professor sighed heavily, like a man burdened by secrets kept too long. "It's part of a system. These urns were used to control creatures like the ones you've encountered. They were meant to obey those who wielded the urn. But if used improperly, the consequences could be catastrophic." Greg's stance stiffened, his gaze hardening. "What do you mean by improperly?" "If the urn is activated without the correct preparation," Carter explained, "it could not only unleash its power but also destabilize the balance that binds these creatures to their nature." The professor's words only raised more questions. Greg felt certain Carter knew more than he was letting on. "You're saying this thing is somehow connected to their behavior?" Greg asked, meeting Carter's eyes. Carter nodded. "It's possible. If the main force driving these creatures is linked to rituals involving this urn, the control could be fractured." Red huffed. "This all sounds like crap. So what do we do now?" "Find the center," Carter said, lowering his gaze. "It all starts and ends with the leader. He'll be wherever all the threads come together." Greg felt his chest tighten. He knew what that meant. The Alpha. "Thank you, Professor," he said curtly, taking the urn. Carter didn't reply, his heavy silence following them out. The drive back was tense. Red tried to lighten the mood with half-hearted jokes, but Greg was too lost in thought. He replayed every encounter with the creatures in his mind, their gazes, their movements, their behavior. Now he realized it wasn't just chaos. There was a hidden order beneath their primal rage. By the time they reached the forest, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Greg stopped the car at the tree line. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Red asked, glancing uneasily at the dark silhouettes of the trees. "No," Greg replied, stepping out of the car. He grabbed the urn and his pistol, slinging a flashlight over his shoulder. Red followed reluctantly, his steps far less confident. "If we don't make it out, this is on you," Red muttered. Greg didn't respond. His mind was focused on one thing: finding the Alpha and ending this once and for all. The forest closed in around them like a living entity. Twigs cracked underfoot, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. They moved slowly, every sound making Greg turn, his pistol always at the ready. Finally they emerged into a small clearing. At its center, almost hidden from view, stood an old stone structure. "There it is," Greg said, staring at the building. Red nodded uncertainly. "You sure we're ready for this?" "No," Greg replied, "but we don't have a choice." The forest grew darker, as if nature itself had turned its back on this place. Greg and Red stood before the stone structure, its ancient walls covered in moss. Its roof was partially collapsed, yet the building radiated an ominous presence, as if it were alive and watching. "This is it," Red said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If what we're looking for is inside, we're screwed." Greg didn't reply. He gripped the urn in one hand and his pistol in the other. His fingers trembled, but retreating wasn't an option. They approached the entrance. The old wooden doors, cracked and covered in fungus, were partially ajar, as if inviting them inside. Greg pushed one of the doors open, its creak echoing into the darkness. The stench of decay hit them immediately. Inside, their flashlights illuminated crumbling columns and remnants of strange carvings etched into the walls. "You sure it's here?" Red whispered, his gun raised and ready. Greg nodded, scanning the room. "I can feel it." They moved deeper inside, their footsteps echoing loudly. It felt as though the walls absorbed every sound, amplifying the tension. In the center of the room stood another pedestal, similar to the ones they'd seen before. But this one was larger, more imposing, and its symbols glowed faintly with an eerie green light. Atop it lay another urn, but this one was shattered. Greg approached, examining the pedestal closely. "This place was used for something important," he said, touching the broken urn. Red stayed back, his eyes darting to every shadow. "You sure this isn't a trap?" Before Greg could respond, the silence was broken by a sound. A low, resonant roar echoed from somewhere deep within the building. They froze. "It's here," Greg whispered, raising his pistol. The roar came again, closer this time, reverberating through the structure and shaking the ground beneath their feet. Greg turned to Red, nodding toward the exit. "Get out!" "What?" "No," Red protested, shaking his head. "You can't handle this alone." "You're injured," Greg said firmly. "I can handle it." Red hesitated, but then slowly backed toward the exit, throwing one last glance at Greg. "Good luck," he said quietly before disappearing into the darkness. Greg was alone now. The roar came again, this time directly behind him. Greg spun around, his pistol raised. From the shadows emerged the creature. It was the Alpha, the massive beast Greg had been hunting. Its enormous frame was terrifying, covered in dark fur that shimmered in the dim light. Its amber eyes glowed with a feral intelligence, and its razor-sharp claws gleamed as it moved with unsettling grace. Greg took a step back, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The beast stopped, its eyes locked on him. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just an animal. It was something far more dangerous. Greg aimed his pistol at its head. "You think I'm scared of you?" he muttered under his breath, trying to summon the courage to face it. The beast growled, its maw opening wide to reveal sharp, glistening teeth. It took a step forward, then another. Greg fired. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, causing it to stagger for a moment. But it didn't stop. With a feral roar, it lunged forward. Greg dove to the side, feeling the swipe of its claws narrowly miss his face. He hit the ground hard, but managed to squeeze off another shot. This time, the bullet tore into the beast's side, eliciting a piercing howl of pain. But the creature didn't relent. It smashed its paw against the ground, splintering the stone beneath it. Its claws raked through the air, coming dangerously close to Greg with each swipe. Greg rolled to the side, fumbling to reload his weapon. His hands trembled, slick with sweat and blood. But he couldn't stop now. "Come on," he muttered, rising unsteadily to his feet. The beast charged again. This time Greg was ready. He fired straight into its chest. The creature froze mid-step, its massive body convulsing, but it didn't fall. A cold dread crept over Greg as he realized what he was facing. Dropping his pistol, he reached for the knife strapped to his belt. With a roar of his own, he rushed forward, driving the blade into the beast's neck. The blade sliced through flesh and sinew, unleashing a torrent of dark blood. The beast howled in agony, its claws raking across Greg's arm, leaving deep gashes that burned with pain. But Greg didn't let go. He pressed the blade deeper, feeling the creature's lifeblood pour over his hand. The beast thrashed violently, its massive body convulsing. Then, with one final shudder, it went still. Greg collapsed to his knees beside the fallen creature, his chest heaving with labored breaths. His arm throbbed, blood pouring from the wounds, but he barely noticed. It was over. The creature's glowing amber eyes dimmed, and its terrifying form began to lose its otherworldly quality, retreating into something more earthly, more mortal. The air around him shifted. The oppressive silence that had hung in the room was replaced by a quiet stillness, almost serene. Greg lifted his head, trying to comprehend what had just happened. His thoughts turned immediately to Kitty. This had all been for her survival, her future. But now what? Greg pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He turned away from the beast's lifeless body, leaving it where it fell, and headed toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the first light of dawn pierced through the trees, bathing the forest in a soft, golden glow. The air felt different, cleaner, lighter, as though something fundamental had changed. Birds began to sing, breaking the silence that had hung over the woods. By the car, Red was waiting, his face a mixture of disbelief and relief. "You're alive," he said, approaching Greg cautiously. "Damn it, you actually did it?" Greg nodded, unable to summon the words. "What about the urn?" Red asked, glancing toward the car. Greg looked at the back seat where it lay. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said quietly. Red opened his mouth to reply, but stopped when he saw the exhaustion etched into Greg's face. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's get out of here." They drove back in silence. Greg stared out the window, his mind far away. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Everything he had done was for her. When they arrived at the hospital, Greg went straight to Kitty's room. She lay there just as she had before, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Greg pulled up a chair beside her bed, gently taking her small, cold hand in his. He sat silently for a moment, his heart heavy with guilt and hope. "Kitty," he whispered, his voice trembling. Her fingers twitched faintly in his grasp. His breath caught. And then her eyelids fluttered open. At first, her gaze was distant, unfocused. But then, a spark of recognition lit in her eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakably hers. Tears streamed down Greg's face as he leaned forward, cradling her hand in his. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. She looked at him, her gray eyes bright with a light that hadn't been there before. Greg felt his heart swell. The curse, whatever it had been, was gone. He didn't know how or why, but it didn't matter. She was alive, and she was his little girl again. In the days that followed, life began to return to normal. Kitty recovered faster than the doctors had anticipated, her strength and energy returning in ways that seemed almost miraculous. She didn't remember much of what had happened, and Greg didn't press her for details. Her laughter, her joy, those were all that mattered now. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Kitty played with a crown of dandelions they had picked earlier in the day. "Daddy, look!" she exclaimed, holding up the makeshift crown. Greg smiled, his heart full for the first time in what felt like forever. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, placing the crown gently on his head. Kitty burst into giggles, her laughter filling the air like music. In that moment, Greg knew it was over. The nightmares, the monsters, the darkness, they were behind him now. And in their place was light. Kitty's laughter, her life.